Right, welcome back as we're getting more reaction on the passing of the late former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, as we are reflecting on his legacy right here on SA Today. We are joined in the studio by Rutendo Matinyerere, who is one of the activists of Zimbabweans Unite, to come and tell us about his thoughts regarding the late president. Rutendo, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to pass my condolences to the Mugabe family and the family of Zimbabwe and all Africans that have lost a great leader.
Rutendo, we are hearing the reaction from different quarters that, let's take, for example, Musi has just said the Africans who were liberated were finding it difficult to liberate themselves from the liberators. Is that how Robert Mugabe should be remembered?
I find it very difficult to take Musi seriously, considering his position as a leader of a political party that was part and parcel of oppressing people in South Africa, a political party that advances the interests of white monopoly in South Africa. But more importantly, he doesn't give us the metrics that he's using to judge Mugabe. What is liberation? How do we judge Mugabe's liberation if we don't look at his performance? For instance, the way that he educated Zimbabweans better than any other African country. He educated Zimbabweans even better than African Americans are educated in America, the literacy rate of Zimbabwe, and he also emancipated Zimbabweans by giving them their land, control of their resources, control of their currency. And today we've got billionaires, organic millionaires in the country because of what it is that Mugabe has done.
How should he be remembered?
He should be remembered as a Pan-Africanist. He should be remembered as somebody that fought against imperialism. He should be remembered as the leader that is the reason why we don't have AFRICOM in Southern Africa, because he made sure that all the imperial activities that were happening in Mozambique, Congo, and the destabilization that was being done in Southern Africa was taken care of by sending our army into those countries to make sure that we've got stability and peace.
Let's take it from where his government took off, the handling of the Lancaster Agreement. Do you think it was badly handled from the beginning?
The Lancaster Agreement was an agreement that was signed under duress. Leaders that were harboring our leaders were pressured to force Mugabe and the Patriotic Front to go and negotiate at a time where they didn't want to negotiate. They were winning in the bush. They felt that they were going to be able to sufficiently defeat Smith for them to be able to get total victory. But the British, the Americans were not interested in total victory because they wanted to safeguard white property rights in Zimbabwe, and by so doing, property rights in South Africa and Namibia. And so they forced Mugabe to go and negotiate.
But he got angry during the negotiations and walked out.
Yes, he did. And unfortunately for him, there was going to be a transitional authority that was managing Zimbabwe under a British let's call him an administrator. The problem with that is that even if Mugabe was not happy with the agreements that they reached, they would not have been able to come home because they would still have had to come under the oppression of the very same European government that was in charge.
How do you describe him as a leader, especially when he's confronted by a dog-eat-dog world kind of a situation where he had to battle against Joshua Nkomo?
Mugabe was a brilliant leader. And I hear a lot of people talk about a genocide that happened because of differences between Joshua Nkomo and Mugabe. I don't know what informs that. Because when you read the 5 independent reports that exist, no 20,000 people were killed in Zimbabwe. In fact, we had a group of people that were being financed by the apartheid government in what was called the total destabilization campaign that they were undertaking in the SADC region, in which we had a group called Super Zapu that were brought up to try and bring tribal conflict. In that tribal conflict and what was supposedly a civil war, we had a war that took place where our army had to go and stop this tribal uprising and these differences that were happening that were being financed and fomented by the West. And with that, we then had an amnesty in 1997. What I don't understand is, why would there be an amnesty when there was a massacre? Why would there be an amnesty and laying down of arms by two sides or two or more sides?
The fact of the matter is that one would not deny that there had been polarization of the Shonas and Ndebeles because of the people that had died at the time. But then let's move forward, because whether to deny or accept that people died for now won't take us anywhere. Let's look at the issue of how he survived. Look at the likes of Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, how they were assassinated for what they stood for. This is the leader who managed to survive until he died, his untimely death now. How do you interpret that?
Before this period that we were talking about, there were 3 attempts on Robert Mugabe's life, including the bombing of the ZANU-PF headquarters. And the reason they wanted to eliminate him is that they had preferred Joshua Nkomo to have been the leader of Zimbabwe, because to them he was a Nelson Mandela who would be able to accommodate white interests much more than black interests. And they failed to kill Robert Mugabe. And part of the reason they failed to kill Robert Mugabe is that because of the fact that Zimbabwe was liberated by the gun, they had created a military arm, military force, and intelligence system that did not rely on the Rhodesians to protect Robert Mugabe. And because of that, that army and one of the best intelligence services on the African continent were able to keep Mugabe from being assassinated. Other leaders, like when you look at Thomas Sankara, had people in his midst who were trained by the French. Blaise Compaoré had been trained by the French. He was a French legionnaire. In other words, he was a Manchurian candidate for the French. That's why they were able to kill him. That didn't happen in Zimbabwe.
Tell us about the internal rebellion, especially when one would ask, if the Zimbabweans were not happy about the political atmosphere, the economic performance of the country, and therefore wanting a change in government, Mugabe really stood firmly against regime change. He said that would never happen. What do you make out of a leader who doesn't want to be dethroned, even through a democratic process?
The issue is the moment that Zimbabwe was put under sanctions, the country went into war. It was a situation of war. And when you even look at the Americans themselves calling for a national emergency against Zimbabwe, that national emergency was actually a declaration of war, and a lot of people don't understand. The difference is that it employed 2 different weapons. It employed, number 1, economic weapons, which are the sanctions that are there, but the American president has got the discretion to put his military into Zimbabwe, utilizing the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that went with that national emergency. So that means that Zimbabwe was declared, or war was declared on Zimbabwe by the Americans. The moment that happened, that country was no longer a country that was being a democracy. It was a country that was being destabilized. It was a country in which the government was being prevented from executing or delivering its services. And because of that, that country could not have democracy because it was no longer in a democratic scenario.
As it may, many people fled the country, and they are foreigners on the African continent and in the diaspora. But one would have thought that at this time, Zimbabweans abroad would have wanted to go back home, but there's a clip that we played. There's another Zimbabwean who says if there's any South African who wants any Zimbabwean to go back home, they should go there themselves. People don't want to go back home. Things are not changing there.
There's a number of issues. So first of all, I said that the sanctions are actually a condition of war, and conditions of war, or at least war, causes refugees. So that's one issue. The other issue is us as Zimbabweans, by our education, have become people that want to be slaves rather than people that want to self-determine. We've got land, gold, resources in the country, but the Zimbabwean would rather take a CV and give it to a white man to give him a job, rather than for him to be able to work the land himself and dig the resources himself to build the country for himself. That's why I'm one of those people that made that mistake. My friends who stayed in Zimbabwe are millionaires today. I'm not a millionaire because I decided the CV route. That is one of the major reasons why people are in South Africa. It's the refugee situation, but also not wanting to self-determine by taking the hard work and producing.
Let's look at the leadership style of many African leaders in as far as standing for beneficiation and indigenization. Why is this not working for a country that is rich like Zimbabwe?
Well, it's a number of factors. The war situation of the sanctions is one. The sabotage that continues to happen on the African continent by the Europeans, because what they do not need is us having, first of all, capital to be able to process our own resources, and secondly, having the ability and experience to process our own resources, because then European factories would have to close. So those are the factors that are there. Then it's also the mindset of the African who is Europeanized by the education system, who still feels that the investor is a white man, the innovator is a white man, the problem solver is a white man. Robert Mugabe was trying to teach us that we are the farmers, the builders, the miners, and everything that is going to be required to take us forward.
So when we're talking about lack of change in Zimbabwe, the hyperinflation, lack of like solid choice for a currency that one can pursue in that country, look at food shortages and so forth. What should the government of Zimbabwe do now to change the situation?
The first thing that the government of Zimbabwe has got to do is teach Zimbabweans to unite. After teaching Zimbabweans to unite, they need to teach Zimbabweans to collaborate and be the ones that put their capital together to grow their nation. More than 65% of our GDP is currently saved outside the country. We don't need capital from any foreigners. We can actually be able to invest on our own. Then we need to teach Zimbabweans to rely on their own inputs and their own solutions to be able to grow the country. So right now, one of the reasons we're not producing agriculturally is that the seeds of Zimbabwe have been hybridized by foreign companies. Not only that, we're also reliant on foreign fertilizers. We need to start producing our own organic fertilizers, go back to our own seeds so that we are not reliant on hybrids from other countries for our farmers to produce. Because right now the farmers have to keep buying seeds and rebuying seeds together with inputs. And yet we can have our own inputs and our own seeds without having to import those things. Those are the problems.
Let's have a parting shot. Zimbabweans are saying, you South Africans are celebrating political freedom, but you don't have the land. But in Zimbabwe, they are celebrating the so-called economic freedom because they have the land. But the black man is on his own when it comes to the land issue and owning the means of production and also making it without a begging bowl on the international community. What's the way forward?
The way forward is Africans have got to be willing to suffer. We have to be prepared to wear overalls before we wear the suits. The problem that we've got in South Africa right now is that we are more interested in wearing the suit but not wearing the overall. We're interested in selling the resources of our country for debt. We want to drive the BMW without understanding that the cost of that BMW is the continued depletion of our resources that are going to go to the banks and the foreign countries that are giving us this debt. Right now in South Africa, the gold of the country, we've got less than 18 years remaining. What happened to all the gold? $4.5 trillion worth of gold has gone out of South Africa, but we've got a bucket system. We've got coal, we've got chrome, we've got diamonds that have left this country, and this country has given more resources to the world than
but
any other.
But the same with Zimbabwe. They lost their diamonds, unaccounted for.
That's what people say, but is that true? Because when people say that Zimbabwe's diamonds are unaccounted for and Zimbabwe lost $15 billion worth of diamonds, did Zimbabwe ever outproduce Botswana and Russia in diamonds? Because that's what it would take for Zimbabwe to have lost $15 billion worth of diamonds. So as Africans, we need to start wondering where is the information that we use to be able to get lenses onto an issue coming from. And I say a lot of what is reported on Zimbabwe and South Africa is propaganda by white media, which was created to ensure that it continues to indoctrinate our minds to think in a certain way and believe that we're incapable.
All right, let's leave it there. But I think there's so much to talk about the issue of Zimbabwe-South Africa relations. So I guess this is the last time we see you on our program.
Thank you.
Okay, Rutendo Matinyerere is one of the activists of Zimbabweans Unite, speaking to us right here on SA Today. Let's take a break.